The morning began like every other hunting day in the Bitterroot Range, cold, quiet, and endless. November 2010. The kind of dawn where the air burns your lungs and the mountains feel older than memory. The first light came thin and pale, bleeding through miles of fog. Caleb Morrow, 41, zipped his camouflage hunting jacket and pulled his tactical cap low, his breath fogging in steady bursts. At his feet, his black Labrador, Ash, wagged anxiously, tail slicing through mist. The picture of loyalty and restlessness in equal measure. Caleb was a seasoned hunter, methodical, patient, a man who believed that silence was a kind of prayer. He had been coming to these woods since childhood, learning every creek and ridge by scent and shadow. This morning, he was after elk near the northern slopes of the Bitterroot Range, where the pines thickened into near darkness and even sound seemed to slow down. Before stepping off the porch, he paused at the cabin door. His wife, June, stood inside, a mug of coffee cupped in both hands, the window glass fogged between them. Back by sunset, he said, smiling faintly. The same words he'd said 100 times before. June didn't smile back. Be careful, she murmured. He nodded, adjusted the strap on his rifle, and whistled for Ash. The dog bounded ahead, paws kicking frost from the ground. In moments, they disappeared into a blur of gray and green, swallowed whole by the forest. The forest at dawn was a living thing. Fog clung to the pines like smoke from an unseen fire. The smell of wet earth, cedar, and gun oil mixed into something ancient. Each step sent whispers through the underbrush. A distant rifle crack echoed across the valley, bending through the timber like thunder filtered through trees. Caleb stopped for a moment, listening. The woods were too still after the echo faded. Locals said these mountains kept what they wanted. Some said it with a half grin, like a joke told to scare tourists. Others said it quietly, without humor. The Bitterroot had its share of stories: lost hikers, old miners, hunters who walked in with good boots and never walked out. But Caleb wasn't the superstitious type. He trusted skill, compass, and instinct more than folklore. By 9:12 a.m., he radioed a ranger post. Morrow here, heading up the North Ridge. Weather's clear, moving slow. Copy that, came the reply, faint beneath static. Keep us updated. Caleb, visibility drops fast near the ridge. He adjusted his pack, checked the compass again, and continued upward. Ash padded ahead, tail high, nose working the air. The trail narrowed between boulders slick with frost. From here, the valley opened below, a canvas of black pine and silver haze. Caleb paused, exhaled, then moved on, footsteps crunching softly. Hours passed. The sun stayed hidden behind clouds, filtering light in a way that made direction uncertain. Around 2:45 p.m., a ranger reported hearing faint barking echoing through the valley, short bursts that rose, then stopped. They assumed it was Caleb's dog. No one thought much of it then. By 4:10 p.m., radio contact was lost. Static replaced his check-in frequency, the kind that hissed like breathing through a long tunnel. Rangers tried reaching him again, but only a rhythmic pulse came back. 3 seconds of dead air, then silence. When the sky dimmed to steel gray, June felt the first tremor of fear. Caleb never broke schedule. At 6:30, she stepped onto the porch, peering into the tree line, her breath visible in the cold. At 7 p.m., she saw movement between the trees, a flicker of black, a shape breaking the fog. Ash, she called. The black Labrador trotted out from the mist, panting hard, fur matted with mud. Relief washed through her for one heartbeat, until she saw what dangled from the dog's mouth. A glove, a human glove. When she reached for it, it dropped to the ground with a soft thud. Inside, curled against the leather, was a severed human finger, pale, bloodless, cleanly sheared at the joint. Her scream broke the stillness like glass shattering. Within minutes, neighboring cabins came alive, lights snapping on, radios crackling, boots hitting frozen dirt. The sheriff's deputy on duty that night arrived by 8, headlights carving tunnels through fog. He took the glove, sealed it, and crouched to examine the trembling dog. "Where's your master, boy?" he whispered. Ash whimpered and pulled toward the tree line, hackles raised. By midnight, the search was on. Rangers deployed thermal drones and line formations through the forest, flashlights cutting across the mist like small fires. They found Caleb's rifle leaning against a pine, one round chambered. Safety off. Nearby lay his half-empty canteen and a single glove. Its twin. No blood. No footprints beyond that point. Just disturbed soil where the leaves seemed burned. The volunteers whispered among themselves. He might have run into poachers. No. A bear? Maybe he fired and missed. Or the mines up north. Sinkholes. Each theory sounded thinner than the air. Ash paced endlessly, tethered beside the ranger truck, eyes fixed toward the ridge. Each time someone approached, he growled low, a deep warning rumble. When the wind shifted, he barked sharply, the sound echoing so far it almost came back changed, like something answered him. By dawn, the mountains had turned blue with cold. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors stirring the fog but revealing nothing. The team followed faint impressions downhill, boot prints leading toward a shallow ravine, ending abruptly at a boulder slick with frost. From there, nothing, as if he had stepped out of existence. June stayed wrapped in a blanket on the porch, watching the tree lean as though staring hard enough might bring him back. Searchers came and went, their faces pale, their voices low. When someone asked if Caleb had any enemies, she just shook her head. "He was a good man," she said softly. "He didn't deserve to vanish." By the third day, the official line was missing, presumed injured or lost. But in a place like the Bitterroot, everyone knew what that really meant. The wind picked up, rattling branches against the roof, and Ash began to howl, a long, mournful cry that didn't sound like an animal's grief, but like recognition. It echoed across the valley, fading into the distance until it was impossible to tell if the sound was still coming from the dog or something deeper in the forest. As the last light drained from the sky, a ranger muttered what many already feared to believe. "Maybe he's still out there," he said quietly, "but not where we're looking." By morning, when the snow began to fall, searchers realized the forest hadn't just taken a man, it had brought something back. By the second morning, the Bitterroot forest no longer felt like wilderness. It felt like a crime scene. Helicopters thudded overhead, their rotors scattering mist through the pines. Volunteers in orange vests fanned out in lines across the ridge, calling Caleb's name until their voices frayed. Over 100 people came to help: rangers, hunters, church groups, neighbors who'd known him since boyhood. Everyone believed they'd find him by nightfall. They always did, in these kinds of searches. But the forest had other plans. The first teams found nothing but Caleb's footprints leading downhill before vanishing on open soil. Dogs followed the trail for half a mile, then stopped abruptly where the leaves looked wrong, singed at the edges, as if heat had passed over them but hadn't burned through. The earth beneath was still damp from last week's frost. No sign of fire anywhere. Detective Irene Calloway arrived that afternoon in an unmarked SUV. She was in her mid-40s, sharp-eyed, methodical, a woman who didn't waste words and didn't believe in superstition. She'd been with the county for nearly 20 years, specializing in wilderness disappearances, missing hikers, drowned fishermen, tourists who wandered too far from the trail. Most were tragedies. This one, she could tell immediately, was something else. Her boots crunched through the frosted leaves as she walked the perimeter where Caleb's rifle had been found. The weapon was clean, safety off, one round chambered. He was ready to shoot, she said. Crouching at what? The ranger beside her shifted uneasily. Bears. Maybe. Or something else, she frowned. Gloved fingers tracing a burn mark on a fern. Bears don't carry lighters. By evening, the operation had turned massive. Drones mapped the canopy. Divers checked nearby streams. K-9 units swept every ridge, each coming back confused, disoriented. The dogs would follow a scent strong and sure, then recoil, whining, circling. refusing to go farther. It was as if they'd reached an invisible line at the base camp. Tables filled with coffee thermoses and topo maps. Locals swapped theories under breath. Poachers, one said. That's why his rifle's still there. Another shook his head. Maybe he fell down a mine shaft. The mountains up here are hollow, someone else whispered. The old-timers say there's tunnels, deeper than anyone remembers, used by loggers back in the 40s. Calloway wrote it all down, but didn't react. Let's deal in evidence. Not ghost, she muttered. Then the lab results came back on the severed finger the dog had carried home. The print patterns were too degraded for ID, but the DNA wasn't Caleb's. It belonged to an unknown male, approximately age 30 to 40, with no matches in the federal database. A stranger, someone who had never existed on paper. When she told June Morrow, the woman just stared at her, eyes hollow. Then whose finger did Ash bring back? That question hung in the room like smoke, and no one could answer it. Over the next week, temperatures dropped below freezing. The sound of axes chopping through ice echoed through the valley as searchers cleared creeks, dragging them for remains. At night, the forest came alive with strange noises, cracking branches, static on radios. The low mechanical buzz of drones tracing heat signatures. Every night at exactly 3 a.m., Ash began to howl. The sound rose long and mournful, vibrating through the cabin walls. On the third night, a deputy on night watch noticed something on the thermal feed, a moving heat source near the same ridge where Caleb had vanished, roughly human-sized. They mobilized within minutes. 3 officers, 2 rangers, and a K-9, and reached the ridge before dawn. The woods were silent. Nothing moved. No tracks in the frost. When they reviewed the feed later, the heat signature was still visible, stationary now, exactly where the rifle had been found. Faulty equipment, one tech said. Thermal ghosts. Happens when the lens fogs. But Calloway didn't think so. The reading had been too distinct, too sharp. She printed it anyway and slipped it into the case folder. By day 10, exhaustion replaced hope. Helicopters burned through the last of their fuel. Volunteers began drifting home. The forest remained mute, vast, indifferent, holding its secrets. The only sound that didn't fade was Ash's nightly howl. The dog grew thin, pacing the same line outside the cabin door, his eyes fixed toward the ridge as if waiting for something to step out of the fog. Then, on the 12th day, snow began to fall, big, heavy flakes that clung to everything. It blanketed tracks, buried evidence, sealed the forest under a white silence. By the 14th day, the official search was called off. Detective Calloway stood at the edge of the tree line as the last team packed up. Snowflakes gathered in her hair. So that's it? She asked the ranger captain beside her. He nodded grimly. Missing. Presumed dead. There's nothing else to find. But she didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the dark spine of pines vanishing into fog. She couldn't shake the feeling that the forest hadn't stolen him. It had kept him, like something unfinished. That night, she sat in her office under the dim yellow light, writing the final line of her report. Then she stopped halfway through, the pen hovering over paper. Instead of closing the file, she sealed it in a separate envelope and wrote a single word across the front. Open. And she did keep it open, tucked inside her desk drawer, under a stack of forgotten paperwork. Years would pass, and she'd take it out every so often, reading her own notes, tracing the photo of Caleb's smiling face beside his dog. She didn't know why she couldn't let it go. Maybe because the forest never gave back what it took. Maybe because deep down, she knew it wasn't finished. Years passed. The dog aged. The forest healed. Until the snow melted and something else surfaced. For 11 years, the forest kept its silence. Seasons passed, roots thickened, and snow buried every memory of that November day. Locals stopped mentioning the name Caleb Morrow, as though forgetting might undo the loss. The trail he vanished on became overgrown and unmarked, reclaimed by ferns and saplings. Only the occasional hiker passing through the Bitterroot Range would mention the way the woods still felt watched, as if the trees remembered. Then, in the spring of 2021. After an unusually heavy snowmelt, the mountains shifted. A landslide tore down one of the southern slopes near the old trail, uprooting pines and splitting open a section of earth untouched since the original search. When rangers arrived to clear debris, one of them spotted a dull camouflage strap poking through the mud. At first, they assumed it was old hunting gear, but when they brushed away the silt, they found a satchel, leather cracked, metal corroded, still sealed at the buckle, stamped faintly across the shoulder strap. C.M. The air turned heavy. Word spread quickly. Within hours, the site was taped off, and the sheriff's department reopened the Morrow case file for the first time in over a decade. Inside the satchel were 3 items, each stranger than the last. First, a corroded GPS unit, half crushed but intact enough to recover fragments of data logs. Its last recorded coordinate was only 2 miles from where Caleb's rifle had been found. Second, an old film camera, the kind that used physical rolls of 35 millimeters. The outer casing dented but sealed shut by mud and time. And third, a small, waterproof match tin, the kind hunters used to keep flint and tinder dry. But when the ranger unscrewed it, he froze. Inside were bones, several finger joints, and 2 splinters of charred bone, dark and brittle. The items were rushed to Helena for forensic processing. Results came back within the week. DNA testing confirmed that part of the bone sample belonged to Caleb Morrow, but the second set, smaller, similarly burned, matched the unknown male whose severed finger had been analyzed back in 2010. The same man who wasn't Caleb, the same one who, officially, had never existed. Detective Irene Calloway, now nearing retirement, drove up from Missoula when she got the call. 11 years had done little to dull her curiosity. They found him, the sheriff told her over the phone, but the way he said it made her stomach twist. They didn't find him whole. The new evidence reopened everything. This time, they brought in Dr. Alexei Park, a forensic geochemist specializing in environmental burn patterns. A scientist with a calm voice and eyes that noticed too much. Under a microscope, he studied the bone fragments, the soil embedded in the tin, the chemical signatures that could reveal how long they'd been exposed. His conclusion left the room silent. The bones were burned, he said, tapping the glass slide, but the surrounding sediment wasn't. No thermal damage, no carbon displacement, meaning, he paused, looking at Irene. They weren't burned here. They were burned elsewhere and then placed into this container intentionally. Irene leaned back, arms crossed. Someone buried them. Not buried, he said softly. Preserved, outside the lab. Thunder rolled across the valley, the sound echoing like distant gunfire. When the recovered items were presented to the family, June Morrow was there. Her hands trembled as she stared at the satchel, worn and caked in mud. A video technician played back footage from the excavation, the moment the satchel was unearthed. Ash's old collar visible in the background of an archived photo from 2010. June gasped when she saw it. The dog frozen mid-sniff in a memory she hadn't looked at in years. He led them to it, she whispered. The room went still. Someone played an old clip from the original search. Ash circling near the ridge, nose pressed to the ground, barking toward the slope that now, 11 years later, had given up its secret. 2 weeks after that clip was filmed, the dog had died quietly in his sleep beside the cabin porch. June always said he'd been waiting for something, or someone, before letting go. Now, seeing the satchel finally recovered, she began to cry, covering her mouth as if the sound might disturb the dead. Detective Calloway stepped outside. The forest beyond the police cordon looked almost the same as it had back then, only now the snow was gone, and the ground was soft, restless. She imagined Caleb walking out there again, following tracks only he could see, never realizing he was stepping into history's loop. Back at the lab, Dr. Park examined the corroded GPS. Most of its circuits had collapsed, but its memory card survived. Data logs showed dozens of coordinates, all consistent with normal hunting routes, except for one strange anomaly. A single reading recorded at an impossible elevation. roughly 30 feet below surface level. He frowned. This device thought it was underground. Irene didn't respond. She just stared at the coordinates. Her instincts stirring. Something about the spot sat wrong. As if the ground itself had rewritten Caleb's final position. That evening, she returned to the evidence table where the other recovered items lay. The film camera sat sealed in a plastic bag, its black casing dulled by corrosion. One of the techs had labeled it Kodak Max. Roll intact, possible images. She picked it up, turning it slowly in her hand. After 11 years, she muttered. You'd think the film would have dissolved. It should have, the tech replied. But somehow, the seal held. There might still be a few frames left. Calloway felt a chill creep up her arms. There was always something cruel about objects that survived when people didn't. Like pieces of the world refusing to let go. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of the satchel again, the initial CM, barely visible beneath the stains. The sight hit her with an ache she hadn't expected. She remembered the way June had stood in the doorway that first night, clutching the glove, the dog pacing the edge of the trees. Some part of her had always known the forest wasn't done with them, and now it wasn't. Because buried inside that old film camera was something no one could have predicted. One final undeveloped frame, perfectly preserved, waiting to be seen. But one final clue remained in the camera. A single undeveloped frame that shouldn't have survived. The hum of the forensics lab filled the room like a slow heartbeat, the kind of sound that made silence feel alive. Dr. Alexei Park stood over the scanner, sleeves rolled up, face lit by the soft glow of the monitor. The film from Caleb's camera shouldn't have survived 11 Montana winters. But somehow it had, sealed by mud and time. Like the forest itself had chosen to keep it intact. He fed the reel through the machine, frame by frame, every image flickering like a heartbeat returning after years of stillness. Most of it looked ordinary, frost on pine bark, the corner of a tent, gloved hands adjusting a rifle scope. Then Caleb himself appeared. Self-timed shots, half smiles caught between breaths. The kind of photos people take without knowing they'll be the last ones they ever take. For a moment, the images made him feel real again. Then came the final frame. Park froze. He leaned closer, the scanner light trembling over his face. Caleb stood in a clearing, camouflage hunting jacket bright against a wall of gray trees. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, just beyond the edge of focus, another figure stood. A man, still and watching, same jacket, same rifle, same cap. Everything matched down to the smallest detail. Except the expression. The man's face was pale, his eyes wide, mouth slightly open as if caught mid-breath. In one hand, he held an old-style radio, the kind used decades ago before GPS trackers and digital comms. The timestamp burned across the film's edge red, November 14th, 2010, for 12 p.m., minutes after Caleb's last known radio call. Park called Detective Calloway immediately. By the time she arrived, the image was magnified across the lab's main monitor. Look here, he said quietly, pointing to a glint. Near Caleb's waist, the reflection, it came from a metal flask clipped to his belt, and the mirrored surface, just barely visible, was the same man again, but from another angle, staring straight into the lens. Double exposure? Calloway asked, her voice thin. Park shook his head. No bleed, no chemical overlap, two separate light sources. One. Exposure. So the camera caught someone who shouldn't have been there, she said slowly. Or, he replied, it caught something repeating what was already there. The photo spread fast through the state network. Analysts, historians, even amateur hunters tried to explain it. A poacher in mirrored gear. A visual echo caused by lens reflection. A trick of mist, but none of them could explain the jacket, the rifle, or the small tear along the shoulder seam. An exact match to Caleb's. It looked like he'd photographed a version of himself, older, faded, standing where he hadn't yet walked. Calloway couldn't shake the sense she'd seen it before. 2 days in the archives proved her right. A file from 1982. Paper yellowed and brittle, stopped her cold. John A. Weiler, 37, forest surveyor and hunter. Last seen near the North Ridge. His weapon, a Remington 700 bolt action, serial 482. B. Caleb's rifle was serial 482. A. Consecutive. Models from the same manufacturing batch. She stared at the photos side by side. The same terrain, the same type of jacket, the same air of stillness frozen in two different centuries. He didn't just vanish, she whispered to herself. He found the last man who did. The next morning, she brought the file to Park. He scanned the documents in silence, his brow furrowing as he compared the serial numbers. Then the man behind Caleb wasn't a stranger, he said. He was what's left of someone the forest didn't give back. Outside, snow began to fall again, the first storm of the new winter, sweeping across the windows like ash. They went back to the audio logs from 2010. The sheriff's department had stored the analog file on an old drive that hadn't been touched in years. It began with static, a hiss of wind and interference. Then Caleb's voice came faintly through the noise, steady but strained. North Ridge, movement, copy that. Then silence, then a pulse. Park filtered the audio, stripping out the wind and static. Beneath it was rhythm, a repeating frequency that wasn't random. That's structured, he murmured. Emergency broadcast pattern, distress code? Calloway asked. Older, he said. This matches military emergency frequency 338. It was discontinued in 1984. She turned slowly. You're telling me his radio was responding to a frequency that hasn't existed for nearly 40 years, he nodded. Someone was transmitting. The room felt heavier. The lab's lights seemed to dim, the way light does before a storm. Park zoomed in on the waveform, aligning the signal peaks with the timestamps from the film. Each pulse in the recording matched the sound of the camera shutter, exactly one beat per frame. The radio wasn't just picking up static, he said quietly. It was responding to the act of being photographed. Calloway stared at the glowing screen, at the frozen image of Caleb standing in the clearing. The pale man behind him now looked less like an intruder and more like an echo caught mid-motion. Something outside time. Looking back, neither spoke. The hum of machinery filled the room, a constant low vibration that made every breath feel loud. The monitor flickered as the photo cycle looped again and again, the reflection gleaming like an eye that refused to close. Finally, Calloway whispered, "Whatever took him out there, it wasn't chance. It wasn't an accident." She leaned closer to the image, voice barely audible now. It was waiting. Park's reflection hovered beside hers on the glass, overlapping Caleb's frozen outline. "What was?" he asked quietly. Her eyes didn't move from the man in the mist, the one holding the radio, the one who shouldn't have existed. "Whatever took Caleb," she said, the words trembling out like a secret the forest already knew, hadn't been hunting him. She exhaled, voice breaking into silence. It had been waiting for him. When spring thawed the Bitterroot Range again, the search teams returned, not for a man this time, but for the truth the mountain had refused to give up. The drone survey swept low over the ridge where Caleb's rifle had been found, the same slope where the snow always seemed to linger longest. Its thermal sensors picked up a strange anomaly, a hollow cavity beneath the rock shelf, deep and uniform, as if something had been carved out and sealed long ago. Crews hiked in within days, cutting through thickets of cedar and pine that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The entrance wasn't visible until one ranger's boot sank through a patch of soft ground and revealed old timber buried beneath the moss. Remnants of a collapsed hunting shack, rotted beams barely clinging to shape. When they dug further, they found what the forest had hidden all this time: two rifles, fused together by rust, lying side by side in the dirt, one registered to Caleb Morrow, 2010, the other, John Weiler, 1982. Beneath them, fragments of charred bone, warped metal, and the faint outline of human remains melted into the soil. The air inside the cavity was stale and metallic, thick with the scent of decay and minerals. It felt less like discovery and more like intrusion. Forensics confirmed what the Earth had been keeping secret. Both men had died here, decades apart, yet side by side. The soil surrounding the remains bore residual heat patterns, detectable even after 40 years, but no accelerant, no soot, no trace of combustion in the air pockets. It was as if the heat had come from nowhere, burning from within the ground itself, sealing them together in a quiet, chemical silence. Detective Calloway stood at the rim of the excavation pit, coat flapping against the wind. She looked down at the intertwined rifles, their barrels pointing in opposite directions. Like two witnesses frozen mid-turn, they found each other, she said softly. Across years, Dr. Park nodded beside her, staring at the charred soil under his gloves. Or the ridge found them both, he murmured. Reporters later framed it as coincidence. Two hunters drawn to the same spot. Victims of exposure, trapped by weather, but the data didn't fit. The last signal from Caleb's radio still pulsed faintly on frequency 338, a pattern impossible to replicate, and deep in the soil. The magnetic field around the shack was distorted, as if something had folded in on itself there, compressing years into one place. When the excavation ended, the forest closed again. Grass began to reclaim the site. The air settled into that familiar, reverent quiet, the kind that never feels empty, only listening. Weeks later, Irene Calloway filed her final report. She wrote the official summary in precise, detached language. Remains recovered. Evidence inconclusive. Case closed. But she didn't believe it. Before she left the ranger station for good, she drove up the old dirt road one last time. The one that led to the trailhead where Caleb and his dog had vanished all those years ago, at the base of the ridge. She hammered a small bronze plaque into the trunk of a pine. The engraving was simple, "For those the forest keeps." The words gleamed faintly in the late afternoon sun, just enough to catch the eye before the shadows swallowed them. For a long while she stood there, listening. The wind moved through the trees in slow waves, whispering between the branches. It almost sounded like voices, two men speaking softly, one familiar, one forgotten. She thought about the photo, Caleb in the clearing, the pale man behind him, both caught between seconds. Maybe the forest wasn't a place where people vanished. Maybe it was a mirror, one that sometimes reflected the past so clearly that it pulled you inside. Maybe the forest didn't take. Maybe it kept memories, echoes, the weight of every footstep that ever crossed its floor, waiting for someone to listen. As she turned back toward her truck, a sound drifted faintly through the distance, a single bark, far away, echoing off the ridge. It was sharp, low, and unmistakable. She stopped walking. The wind carried it again, softer this time, fading into the tree lean. She didn't look back. Her voice, steady but hollow, carried the final words in her report. "If you ever walk these woods," she said quietly, "and hear a dog bark where no dog should be, turn back. The trail remembers." The forest swallowed the sound, as if agreeing. And then, just silence. Every trail tells a story, but some stories never end where they began. Don't let theirs fade. Subscribe to keep their voices and every soul the forest keeps alive.